welcome. Tonight, we step quietly into the heart of time, into the oldest landscapes on Earth, where the first humans once walked beneath ancient skies. In the silence of deep time, Africa held the earliest breath of what would become us, fragile, curious, enduring. Let your mind drift now. As you listen, you'll follow the gentle footprints of our ancestors across warm savannas and shaded valleys, into a story that began long before memory and still whispers in our bones. Around 7 million years ago, the Earth was already ancient. Oceans had long traced their slow circles across the globe. Mountains had risen and crumbled. Life had blossomed, vanished, and begun again. But somewhere in the heart of Africa, where warm air drifted over acacia plains and trees whispered in the sun, a subtle change had begun. And from that change, something remarkable would slowly, gently unfold. At that time, the ancestors of what we now call humans were not yet walking fully upright. They lived in the trees and on the ground, their fingers curled for climbing, their movements cautious but curious. One of the earliest creatures we know from this shadowed border between ape and human is Sahelanthropus chadensis. Its skull, found buried beneath desert sands in Chad, shows a blend of features: a small brain case, yet a face more vertical, with signs that it might have walked, at least partially, on 2 legs. The date of its life? Around 6 to 7 million years ago. There is something deeply quiet about these early ancestors. They lived without cities, without language as we know it, without even the need to imagine the future. Their world was immediate: food, shelter, safety. And yet, in the rhythm of their existence, something was shifting. Their bones tell us the story, not in words, but in subtle lines of evolution that echo through time. Africa then was not one single environment. It was a land of forests and rivers, of open woodlands and volcanic highlands. These shifting climates over millions of years played a gentle but relentless role in shaping the early path of human evolution. As trees thinned into grasslands, our ancestors began to stand more often on 2 feet, perhaps to see farther across the tall savanna grass, perhaps to carry food or infants, perhaps just because those who could adapt survived more easily. From these early walkers came Australopithecus, creatures with smaller brains but upright posture who lived between 4 and 2 million years ago. Their footprints, like those found in the ash at Latoli in what is now Tanzania, speak to us across unimaginable time. A pair of early hominins walked side by side, their steps preserved in volcanic dust more than 3.6 million years ago. One was larger, one was smaller. Some think it was a parent and child, others see companions, or simply 2 beings moving through their day. No one knows for certain, but the prints remain, gentle reminders that the earth once held their weight. Unlike apes, Australopithecus had pelvises shaped for bipedal motion, and their hands suggest both tool use and climbing. They were not yet us, but the spark was there. They lived in groups, possibly used primitive sounds to communicate, and most importantly, they adapted again and again to the pressures of time and change. The air they breathed was older than we can imagine. The stars they saw were the same as ours. Their lives were short, perhaps 20 to 30 years on average. But in those short lifespans, their genes carried something forward. A quiet gift, the beginnings of something vast. And so, time moved on, slowly, steadily. The earth turned beneath them, unchanged in its patience. Species came and went. Forests grew and retreated. And somewhere, within the lineage of Australopithecus, a new shape of skull began to form. Larger, rounder, more complex. The brain inside it was still small compared to today, but growing. Africa watched. The rivers flowed. The rains fell in rhythm as they always had. The sun rose on the great rift valleys, casting golden light over basalt stones and shallow lakes. Life went on, quietly, without knowing what was coming, but something had begun. A long story that would carry across generations, through bone and fire and thought, to become us. The story continued, slow and patient, as the earth turned beneath African skies. From the evolving branches of Australopithecus, something new emerged. Not suddenly, but gradually, as all things in nature do. It was a creature with slightly longer legs, a slightly larger brain, and, most importantly, a set of hands that began to shape the world. We call this being Homo habilis, the handy man. It lived roughly 2.4 to 1.4 million years ago in the regions that are now Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia. Its body was still small, just over a meter tall, but its hands, with their precision grip and opposable thumbs, were different. These hands could hold a stone and strike it. The earliest tools associated with Homo habilis are simple, unrefined, just flakes of rock chipped away from larger stones, sharp enough to cut meat or scrape hides. But in those rough edges lies a profound step. For the first time, a creature had begun to shape nature to its will, not merely adapt to it. The Oldowan tool culture, named after the Olduvai Gorge where many examples were found, marks a turning point in the human journey. It is not the tools themselves that make it extraordinary. It is the intention behind them. These early humans weren't just surviving. They were solving problems, making decisions, passing on ideas. A mental shift had occurred, and with it, the brain began to grow. Their lives remained hard. Danger was everywhere: saber-toothed cats, crocodiles, disease, drought. But Homo habilis endured. In groups, they shared food, protected each other, and perhaps, though we can never know for sure, began to share something even more intangible: thought, memory, pattern. The world they inhabited was rich and changing. Africa during this time was a land of dramatic transitions. Lakes swelled and dried. Grasslands expanded and forests contracted. These shifts pressed early humans to move, to adapt, to become more flexible in their diets, in their behaviors, in their very biology. With stone tools, Homo habilis could scavenge more effectively, accessing marrow and meat left behind by larger predators. This extra nutrition likely played a role in the growth of their brains. A simple chipped rock led to a profound transformation, not in a generation, but over hundreds of thousands of years. Their faces, reconstructed from fossils, still appear primitive to us: heavy brows, small chins, broad noses. But in those faces lies the foundation of our own. Their bones carry the trace of a journey we still walk. And beneath their skulls, the brain, still small, still limited, was beginning to fire in more complex patterns. Not yet language, not yet art, but the early rhythm of something deeper. Evidence suggests that Homo habilis lived in social groups. They may have shared simple tasks, protected each other's young, and perhaps mourned the loss of kin. Burial did not yet exist, but memory, in some embryonic form, may have stirred. In the dry riverbeds and open plains of East Africa, these early humans left behind few signs of their passage. But those they did leave, stone flakes, broken bones, primitive shelters, offer a whisper of their world. They hunted small animals, gathered fruits, cracked nuts. Theirs was a life of constant motion, following the rhythms of nature, never staying long in one place. And yet, even as they wandered, they carried with them more than tools. They carried knowledge, how to make, how to do, how to survive. That knowledge, passed not in books, but through silent example and repeated action, was the seed of culture. The first culture. Homo habilis did not last forever. Over time, as climates continued to change and new pressures emerged, other forms of humans began to rise. But habilis left behind more than bones. It left a template, the mind that shapes, the hand that builds. The African sun continued to rise over dry plateaus and green valleys. Storms came and went. Volcanoes rumbled in the distance, and beneath the great sky, humans continued their slow, patient journey towards something still unseen. With each generation, brains grew slightly larger. Tools became slightly more refined. Life remained simple, but thought was becoming more complex. The earth, unchanged in its rhythms, watched as its creatures adapted, survived, and grew more aware of the world around them. A spark had been struck, not just in stone, but in mind. And so we move forward, not in leaps, but in quiet steps, toward a new form, a new being, one whose name would echo louder across time. Up ahead waited Homo erectus, the walker, the firekeeper, the first great traveler. Time passed, slowly and without notice. The skies above Africa changed little, the stars turning their nightly wheel as they had for eons. But on the ground, something profound was taking shape. From the lineage of toolmakers and upright walkers emerged a new kind of human. Taller, stronger, more capable of enduring the demands of a changing world. We call them Homo erectus, upright man. They appeared over 1.8 million years ago and would remain among the most enduring of all human species. These early humans walked fully upright, with bodies more like our own. Long legs, short arms, broad hips built for travel. Unlike their predecessors, they were no longer tethered to the forests or confined to scattered regions. They moved. And in that movement, a new chapter began. Homo erectus was the first human to leave Africa. They crossed into unfamiliar lands, what we now call the Middle East, India, China, Indonesia. Their bones, scattered across continents, tell the quiet story of a species that explored the world not in haste, but in rhythm with the earth. They followed rivers, coastlines, and game trails. They adapted to deserts, forests, mountains. But they didn't leave Africa behind. Their roots remained deep in the soil of the Great Rift Valley, in the volcanic hills of Kenya, the savannas of Tanzania. It was from these ancient landscapes that they stepped forward, carrying not only their bodies, but their minds and their fire. Fire. It is difficult to overstate the importance of this quiet force. Homo erectus is the first human species known to have controlled it, not merely reacting to flames from lightning or volcanic flow, but harnessing it, protecting it, feeding it, perhaps even sharing stories by its glow. The fire brought warmth. It brought protection from predators. It extended the day, offering hours of reflection, learning, and connection long after the sun had set. It softened food, releasing nutrients that fed their growing brains. In that soft orange light, life changed. With fire came more complex tools. Homo erectus refined the hand axe, sharp, symmetrical, and efficient. These Herculean tools reveal not only practical intelligence, but also an early sense of design, a knowledge of form, even perhaps of aesthetics. They hunted in groups, coordinated with others, likely communicated in proto-language. Their social bonds were stronger, their survival strategies more advanced. They did not only live, they endured. For nearly 1.5 million years, Homo erectus walked the earth. Far longer than modern humans have existed. Their bodies, built for endurance, took them across mountains and along coastlines. Their tools adapted to local needs. Their fires flickered across many landscapes. And yet, we know so little of their inner world. Did they wonder? Did they imagine? Did they fear the stars or trace shapes in the firelight? No words remain, no songs. But their legacy echoes in our posture, in our stride, in our instinct to explore. In places like Dmanisi in Georgia, fossilized skulls of Homo erectus reveal the diversity within their kind. Some with large brains, others smaller, all part of a single wide-ranging species. In Java, their bones remained buried until modern archaeologists uncovered them, proving just how far their steps had reached. And yet, for all their distance, they remained deeply connected to Africa. New evidence suggests that Homo erectus did not leave Africa in a single wave, but in many gradual pulses, returning and departing again over hundreds of thousands of years. Africa was not just a cradle, it was a home that never truly let go. In their long walk outward, Homo erectus opened the path for everything that would follow. Their journeys laid the groundwork for later species, including our own. But they were not simply a bridge to something greater. They were in themselves a triumph of survival and adaptation, a testament to the quiet strength of ancient humanity. The earth, ever constant, bore witness to it all. Volcanoes erupted, glaciers advanced, lakes swelled and vanished. Through it all, Homo erectus lived and moved, shaped by the land and shaping it in turn. Then, as time moved forward, the species began to fade. Not in catastrophe, but gradually, as newer forms of humans emerged. More advanced, more adaptable, more like us. But before that next step, the Earth paused. The air grew cooler. The patterns of migration shifted. And in one corner of Africa, beneath a sky as old as thought itself, a new being stirred. One whose mind would reach farther, dream deeper, and ask why. The age of Homo sapiens was on the horizon. Roughly 300,000 years ago, under the wide skies of Africa, a new kind of human emerged. They were not gods, not conquerors, just quiet beings, shaped by the wind, the land, and the long, slow memory of evolution. Their bones were lean and upright, their hands skilled and curious. But most of all, it was their minds that marked them as different. They were Homo sapiens, wise man. The name is given by us long after they walked the earth. But even then, without knowing, they were already beginning to think in ways no other creature had before. Not just of tools or fire or food, but of meaning, of time, of memory, of self. Their brains, nearly the size of ours today, housed a growing complexity. Neurons fired with subtle connections, language began to take shape. Not just signals, but shared sounds, shared understanding. They spoke, perhaps in whispers at first, around the firelight or beneath the shade of baobab trees. Not with poetry yet, but with purpose. Their world was Africa still. The forests and rivers, the rocky hills, the open savannas. The land provided what they needed: roots, fruits, water, and wild game. But their minds reached beyond survival. They made tools with precision, crafted from flint and bone. They shaped blades and points, awls and scrapers. They tanned hides. They planned ahead. They watched, remembered, and taught. These humans lived in the groups, small, mobile bands of kin. They shared tasks. They raised children. They buried their dead. And it is in those burials that we find the first flickers of something inward. A shell placed near the bones. A bit of ochre smeared across a face. Simple gestures, yet heavy with thought. They were no longer just living. They were beginning to reflect. In the quiet rock shelters of southern Africa, traces remain. At Blombos Cave, ochre pieces with engraved patterns lie buried in sand more than 70,000 years old. Their purpose is unclear. Decoration, perhaps, or ritual. But their presence speaks volumes. These were not just tools. These were symbols, and symbols require imagination. With that imagination came stories, first in thought, then in word, then in song. Perhaps they spoke of animals they hunted, or paths they had traveled. Perhaps they remembered the names of those who had died. Perhaps they told of the stars. Because by now, Homo sapiens were looking upward. At night, the stars glimmered the same as they do now, silent, unblinking, endless. They offered no answers, only questions. And humans, for the first time, were beginning to ask them. The landscapes around them echoed their presence. In places like the Rift Valley and along the coastlines of modern-day Kenya and Ethiopia, they left behind tools, hearths, and footprints. They walked where others had walked, but with a new awareness. They moved not only to survive, but to explore. It was during this time that a great journey began. Slowly, subtly, in waves and pauses. Groups of Homo sapiens began to leave Africa, crossing narrow land bridges and coastal routes, fanning out across the continents. It would take tens of thousands of years. They did not know where they were going, only that they were going, driven by curiosity, by need, by change. But even as some departed, Africa remained full of life. Many groups stayed, evolved, adapted, and flourished. To this day, the genetic roots of all humans trace back to those early African ancestors. Every heartbeat, every breath, every thought, we carry them with us. Unlike Homo erectus, whose path faded with time, Homo sapiens would grow in number, in culture, in impact. They would carve images into stone walls. They would dance, paint, weave. They would create meaning in rhythm and line, color and sound. They would begin to shape the world not just physically, but symbolically. And through it all, they listened. To the winds, to each other, to something deeper. A hunger not of the body, but of the mind. To understand, to belong, to remember. In this stillness, we see the outline of ourselves, not in power, but in presence, not in greatness, but in thought. The first humans in Africa were not yet us, but they carried the beginnings of everything we would become. They stood beneath the same stars, on the same soil, with the same questions. And quietly, in the dark, they began to wonder. For hundreds of thousands of years, the early Homo sapiens lived and thrived within Africa's vast landscapes. The rivers and savannas, the deserts and coasts, were all they knew. Yet something within them, whether born of need, chance, or quiet curiosity, would set them on a journey unlike any before. A journey that would eventually carry their footsteps across every continent. The Great Migration began slowly, long before it left any mark on the world. Small groups of humans, following the rhythm of seasons and the movements of animals, pushed outward. They traveled along river valleys, crossed shallow waters, and found their way through new landscapes. They did not set out to conquer or to discover, but simply to live. Survival led them forward, one horizon at a time. Evidence suggests that some of the earliest migrations began around 100,000 years ago, with groups leaving Africa's northeastern edge, crossing what is now the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula. It may have taken generations, hundreds of years, for a single migration route to fully unfold. For these early humans, time was vast, and journeys were measured not in destinations, but in days, in food found, in safe water to drink. As they moved, they adapted. They learned new ways to live in deserts, in forests, in colder climates. They followed coastlines, where food was abundant and the tides predictable. Along the shores of the Indian Ocean, they left traces of their passage: shell beads, fire pits, scattered tools. But Africa was not left empty. Many groups remained, thriving in its valleys and hills, passing down the wisdom of generations. This outward migration was not a single wave, but many ripples, moving and returning over time. Some groups perished in harsh climates. Others survived, mixing with different human species along the way: Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia. These encounters shaped not just their lives, but their DNA, leaving fragments that remain in us today. The world they entered was full of challenges. Ice Age glaciers covered parts of Europe. Vast deserts and mountains stood in their path. Yet they kept moving, guided by instincts older than memory. They built rafts to cross rivers, fashioned clothing from hides, and sharpened tools to hunt and prepare food. They carried fire with them, keeping embers alive as they traveled, a small circle of warmth in a world that could be harsh and cold. One of the most remarkable aspects of this migration is its slowness. Unlike the fast-paced travel of today, these journeys were measured in generations. Children were born along the way. Elders told stories of lands behind and ahead. The horizon shifted, but the pace remained steady, almost timeless. This slow movement allowed Homo sapiens to not just survive, but to learn the world, to observe, to adapt, to make the unknown familiar. Along the way, their minds continued to evolve. The seeds of culture already present in Africa grew richer. They began to carve symbols, to create art, to perhaps even share myths. A shell bead found thousands of miles from its source is not just an artifact. It is a whisper of connection, of meaning, of early trade or exchange. Africa remained at the heart of this story. Every path, every journey, every settlement that would one day rise on distant continents traces its roots back to the same origin: the valleys and plains where Homo sapiens first walked. By 50,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia, navigating vast stretches of water. By 40,000 years ago, they stood on the edges of Europe. And by 15,000 years ago, they crossed into the Americas. But none of this would have been possible without that first step out of Africa: the quiet, determined movement of a species that carried its future in its hands, its fire, and its memory. As we look back now, it is easy to imagine this as a grand adventure. But for those early humans, it was life. It was the slow passage of days, the gathering of food, the warmth of firelight, the care for children, and beneath it all, an unspoken rhythm, one that connected them to the earth, to the sky, and to each other. This was the journey that changed the world, a journey that continues in every one of us. In the quiet of early dawn, somewhere along the African plains or far beyond, a child may have once sat beside a fire, watching the stars fade into light. Around them, the voices of elders murmured softly. Stories were shared, not in books, but in gesture, in tone, in eyes that had seen many seasons. These small, fleeting moments, forgotten by time, are the true echoes of our beginning. The journey of Homo sapiens is not simply one of migration or survival. It is the story of how the world became human, of how thought took shape, how memory settled into symbols, and how language, community, and belief slowly rose from the dust of the earth. Long after the first humans walked out of Africa, their legacy continued to unfold. Across the globe, they formed cultures that suited the lands they inhabited: hunter-gatherers in frozen tundras, herders in the highlands, foragers in dense forests. Though separated by distance, all carried with them something remarkably similar: the mind of modern humans. They created tools with purpose, not just necessity. They painted animals on cave walls with detail and reverence. They buried their dead with care. These actions reflect something deeper than survival, something that speaks of awareness, of spirit, of questions without easy answers. Africa, the cradle of this journey, holds within its soil more than just fossils. It carries the long breath of human becoming. Every discovery, every jawbone, flint knife, or carved bead is a soft echo of someone who once lived, loved, suffered, and hoped. These ancient ancestors were not so different from us. Their hearts beat to the same rhythm. Their eyes opened to the same sun. The tools they shaped became more refined. The fires they kept became hearths around which knowledge passed. The language they spoke grew richer, forming the roots of all the thousands of tongues we now know. They watched the skies, learned the seasons, and gave meaning to stars. Over time, belief systems emerged, not necessarily to explain, but to honor, to connect, to understand. In this way, early humans laid the foundations of everything we now call civilization. Not in grand monuments, but in thought. The ability to reflect, to wonder, to remember. Even now, we carry their legacy within us. In our hands are the same bones. In our cells, their DNA still sings. Our capacity to imagine, to empathize, to ask who we are and where we come from. These gifts did not appear suddenly. They were shaped across thousands of years, in the quiet moments of life lived close to the earth. Though time has erased the names and faces of our earliest ancestors, they have not vanished. Their existence is etched into us, into our minds, our emotions, our sense of time and place. Each of us is a living branch on a tree that began growing long before the first city rose, long before the first myth was told, long before the wheel turned. Science has brought us closer to them, closer to understanding the landscapes they walked, the tools they held, the challenges they faced. Yet even science remains humbled before the enormity of deep time. For every answer we uncover, a new question quietly arises. Who were the first to understand death? Who first named the moon? Who stood beneath a thunderstorm and felt awe? These are not questions we can resolve with bones and stones, but they remind us of our connection to the past, to each other, and to the mystery of being. As the modern world grows ever louder and faster, there is comfort in slowing down to remember where we began, to step back into the rhythm of early human life, a rhythm of walking, watching, listening, of warmth shared by firelight, of stories passed through generations, not to teach facts, but to preserve meaning. And so, as this journey draws to a close, you may find yourself thinking not of dates or species, but of something quieter, of the earth beneath your feet, of the wind that brushes through trees as it once swept across ancient savannas, of the small truth that you, too, are part of this great unfolding. The story of the first humans in Africa is not a distant tale. It is your story, a story without end, a story that continues, even now, in silence, in sleep, in memory.